The sun was a hammer, and the town of redemption was its anvil. Elara felt the blows in the shimmering air that warped the hard-packed street, in the dust that coated her tongue and settled like a shroud on the shoulders of her dark traveling dress. She had been deposited by the morning train like a misplaced parcel, left to bake on the splintered planks of the station platform. The promise that had brought her here, a whispered guarantee of safety in exchange for silence, already felt like a lie, thin and brittle as a cicada's wing. All around her, the world was a symphony of alien noises: the clang of a smithy's hammer, the shrill laughter from the saloon, the low, guttural murmur of men whose eyes slid over her like greasy hands. She was a thing out of place, a porcelain doll dropped in a pigsty, and the feeling of being watched was a physical weight, pressing down on her with the same unforgiving force as the heat. Her gaze drifted to the slip of paper clutched in her gloved hand. The ink had blurred from the sweat of her palm. Silas Stone, it read, a man of influence. He will see to your needs. For 3 hours she had waited for this man of influence, this supposed savior, while her hope evaporated into the merciless sky. Every man who approached the station, broad-shouldered ranchers, wiry prospectors, merchants with soft hands and calculating eyes, was measured against the name. None claimed it. She stood by her single, scuffed leather trunk, a solitary island in a river of indifference. Her entire life was contained in that trunk, and in the small locked satchel, chained to her wrist, the true reason for her exile. The contents of that satchel were a far heavier burden than all her worldly possessions. She had been told the West was a place to begin again, but the air here tasted only of endings. It smelled of dust, sweat, horse manure, and a thick underlying scent of desperation that clung to everything. Her fine city dress, once a symbol of a life she had been forced to abandon, now felt like a costume, marking her as foreign, weak, and pitiable. The women she saw, faces etched by sun and hardship, looked at her with a mixture of scorn and something that might have been sorrow. They knew. They knew this land did not suffer fools or delicate things gladly, and Elara, for all the steel she kept hidden deep inside, looked very much like both. The sun climbed higher, and the shadows shrank, offering no quarter. Still she waited. Waiting was a skill she had perfected. It was the patient stillness of the spider in its web, a prelude to survival. Caleb rode into town under the same oppressive sun, but to him, it was merely Tuesday. The heat was a known quantity, a familiar adversary. His focus was not on the sky, but on the list committed to memory: salt, flour, cartridges, and the new plow blade he had ordered from a catalog 3 months prior. The town of Redemption was a necessary evil, a place he visited only when supplies ran so low that the solitude of his homestead became a threat rather than a comfort. He tied his horse, a stoic gray gelding named Ghost, to the hitching post outside the general store, the leather of the reins worn smooth and dark by his calloused hands. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life spent conserving energy, his face a landscape of its own, carved by sun and wind, and a sorrow so old it had become part of his bones. He saw her the moment he stepped onto the boardwalk, a slash of dark wool in a world of bleached canvas and faded calico. She was a blackbird in a flock of sparrows, jarring and out of place. He registered her the way he registered all potential threats. Her posture too rigid, her clothes too fine, her presence on the train platform long after the train had departed a question without an answer. Pity was not an emotion he indulged in, but he recognized the look of a lamb waiting for a butcher. He had seen it before. He turned away, his jaw tight. It was not his concern. His world was circumscribed by his property line, by the fence posts he had driven into the unforgiving soil with his own hands. What happened in town to strangers was a story he had no part in. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured leather, and licorice. He gathered his supplies, his interactions with the proprietor clipped and perfunctory. As he paid, the man, a gossip named Henderson, gestured with his chin toward the street. Got a new piece of property in town. Belongs to Silas Stone, they say. Arrived on the morning train. Caleb's face remained impassive, but a cold knot formed in his gut. Silas Stone. The name left a taste like rust in his mouth. Stone was a man who collected things: land, power, people, and his greed was a blight on the valley. Caleb had no dealings with him and intended to keep it that way. He loaded his supplies onto the pack mule, his movements deliberate, trying to push the image of the woman in black from his mind. But when he emerged, she was still there, a fixed point of misery. And now, she was no longer alone. Two men, their faces flushed with whiskey from the saloon, were standing before her, their laughter too loud, their bodies too close. They were circling her like coyotes. Lost, little lady? One of them slurred, reaching a hand out to touch the fabric of her sleeve. Elara flinched back, her body coiling tight as a spring. She did not scream or cry out. Her chin lifted, and her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, turned cold and hard. It was this detail that stopped Caleb. In that flicker of defiance, he saw not a lamb, but something else. Something cornered, yes, but not yet broken. He was not a hero. The part of him that might have been had died years ago with his wife and son, buried under a pair of wooden crosses on a windswept hill. But he was a man who understood boundaries, and he despised bullies. He walked toward the platform, his steps measured and silent. He did not draw his weapon. He did not need to. His presence was enough. The air around him seemed to grow colder, heavier. The two men turned, their drunken bravado faltering, as they took in the sight of him. The sun-bleached hair, the eyes that missed nothing. The quiet, absolute confidence of a man who was dangerous, not because he wanted to be, but because the world had required it of him. She's with me, Caleb said. The words were low and gravelly, a rock slide in the back of his throat. It was a lie, but it fell into the space between them with the weight of truth. The men grumbled, shot him a hateful glare, and shuffled back toward the saloon. Silence descended again, thicker this time. Elara stared at him, her chest rising and falling with breath she had not realized she was holding. Fear, relief, and suspicion warred on her face. She looked from his dusty, worn boots to his impassive expression. He was not her promised savior, not the man of influence. He was something else entirely, something wilder, and perhaps more dangerous. He was the wilderness itself, given human form. You are not Silas Stone, she stated, her voice a low, cultured murmur that was as out of place as her dress. No, he said. He gestured with his head toward the buckboard wagon where he'd been loading his plow blade. Stone's not coming. His foreman broke a leg. Sent word for me to collect a delivery for him. A plow. His eyes flickered to her, then to the trunk. Seems there was a misunderstanding. The lie came easily, a shield to hide the impulsive act he did not himself understand. He could not leave her here. It was a simple, damning fact. To leave her would be to leave a sheep tied to a post. His conscience, a thing he thought long dead, would not allow it. A complication. Of course. Her entire life had become a series of complications. She looked down at the paper in her hand, then back at him. The arrangement was specific, she said, the words stiff with a pride she could barely afford. I am to go to Mr. Stone. Caleb grunted, a sound of pure frustration. He gestured vaguely toward the east, toward the vast, empty expanse of plains and distant mountains. Stone's ranch is 2 days' ride from here. Mine is a day. You can wait here for him to send another man. Maybe next week, maybe the week after. Or you can come with me. I'll see you get to him when I'm able. He did not embellish the offer. He did not soften it. It was a choice between two terrible options, presented without varnish. This was her first test, though she did not know it. He watched her, expecting tears or hysterics, the predictable response of a city woman faced with the brutal realities of this land. He was prepared to turn and walk away if she did. Instead, he saw a flicker of calculation in her eyes. She assessed him. The wagon, the tired horses, the endless dusty roads stretching out of town. She was weighing the known danger of the town against the unknown danger of him. The silence stretched, filled only by the buzzing of flies. Finally, she gave a single curt nod. I will need assistance with my trunk. The acceptance was not surrender. It was a strategic decision. Caleb felt a flicker of something he refused to name. It might have been respect. Without a word, he hefted the surprisingly heavy trunk and swung it onto the back of the buckboard as if it were a sack of grain. He then turned and offered her a hand up to the wagon seat. Her gloved hand was small in his, but her grip was firm. The departure from redemption was not an escape so much as a slow receding. The sounds of the town faded behind them, replaced by the rhythmic clop of hooves, the groan of the wagon wheels, and the vast humming silence of the plains. The world opened up, a terrifying vista of brown earth and blue sky, stretching to an infinite horizon. Elara sat ramrod straight on the hard wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, the chain of her satchel, a cold, constant reminder against her wrist. The landscape was an aggressor. It seemed to want to erase them, to swallow them whole in its immensity. The sun beat down, and the wind was a hot breath that carried the scent of dust and dry grass. It was a world stripped of all softness, all artifice. It was honest in its cruelty. Beside her, Caleb was a figure carved from the same harsh elements. He did not speak. His attention was fixed on the trail ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, the ground, the sky. He seemed a part of the landscape, his silence as natural and profound as that of the ancient, weathered buttes that rose in the distance. Alara found herself observing him, not as a woman observing a man, but as a strategist assessing an unknown force. She noted the way his hands, rough and scarred, were gentle on the reins. She saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, but also the unwavering vigilance. He was not relaxed. He was simply at home in the tension. He moved with the land, not against it. While she felt like an open wound in this place, he was a scar, long healed and tough. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting position of the sun. The journey was a long, silent passage through a world that did not care for their existence. She learned more about him in that silence than she could have from 1,000 words. She saw him read the trail like a book, noting a patch of disturbed earth, the distant movement of an antelope herd, the shift in the wind that might signal a change in weather. He was competent. That was the word that settled in her mind. In a life that had been defined by the treachery and incompetence of powerful men, his simple, unadorned capability was a strange sort of anchor in the vast, terrifying sea of the prairie. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and red, he pulled the wagon to a stop near a small, gnarled cluster of cottonwoods huddling by a trickle of a creek. The sudden cessation of movement was jarring. "Water the horses," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. It was not a request. He swung down from the wagon and began unhitching the team, his movements efficient and practiced. Alara remained seated, her body stiff and aching from the relentless jolting of the wagon. Her muscles screamed in protest. After tending to the animals, he walked to the creek, knelt, and cupped his hands, drinking deeply. He then looked up at her, still perched on the wagon seat. His expression was unreadable. He walked back to the wagon, not to the front where she sat, but to the back. He unstrapped a canteen from his own saddle, which was tied down with his other gear. He walked to her side of the wagon and held it up. He did not speak, but the gesture was clear. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching down and taking it. The metal was cool against her hot, dusty fingers. The water was lukewarm and tasted of tin, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever drunk. She drank sparingly, conscious of his watching eyes, and then handed it back. "Thank you," she whispered. He just nodded, his gaze dropping for a moment to the small, locked satchel on her wrist, before he turned away to build a small, smokeless fire. That small gesture of provision, of offering his own water before taking any for himself from the creek, was a crack in the wall of his stoicism. It was a small, almost imperceptible kindness, and in this brutal landscape, it shone like a beacon. They ate in silence as twilight bled the color from the land. He offered her a piece of dry jerky and a hard biscuit from his saddlebag. It was sustenance, not a meal. As darkness fell, deep and absolute, he laid out his bedroll near the fire. He gestured with his head to the wagon bed. "You sleep there." He then took a rifle from its scabbard and sat with his back against a wagon wheel, facing out into the blackness. He was not sleeping. He was standing watch. For the first time in months, Alara felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation. It was not safety, not yet, but it was the absence of a certain kind of threat. The man beside her might be as hard and unforgiving as the land itself, but his word, she suspected, was solid, and he had given his word to see her delivered. She curled up in the back of the wagon, using her own cloak as a pillow, the hard wood pressing into her bones. The stars that blazed overhead were cold and distant, but for the first time that day, She did not feel entirely alone beneath them. She slept, not well, but deeply, the rhythmic sound of the man's quiet breathing, a strange and unexpected lullaby. They arrived at his homestead as the last light of day was draining from the sky, leaving behind a bruised purple twilight. The place was less a ranch and more a wound that had scarred over. A small, sturdy cabin stood against the backdrop of a vast, empty sky, smoke curling from its stone chimney like a lonely prayer. A barn, a corral, and a few other outbuildings huddled nearby, all of it enclosed by a doggedly maintained fence that seemed to be holding the wilderness at bay through sheer force of will. The isolation was absolute, a physical presence that pressed in from all sides. Alara's heart, which had been cautiously optimistic, sank. This was not a sanctuary, it was a prison of solitude. She had traded a town full of threats for an emptiness that felt just as dangerous. Caleb brought the wagon to a halt near the main cabin. He said nothing, simply climbing down and beginning the familiar ritual of unhitching the horses. The weariness of the journey had settled deep in his bones, but his work was not done. Elara watched him, waiting for instruction, feeling once again like a piece of luggage. After he had led the horses to the barn, he returned and finally looked at her. The firelight from the cabin window caught the angles of his face, throwing his eyes into shadow. "This is not Stone's property," he said, stating the obvious. "The cabin near the creek. That's yours. For now." He picked up her trunk and began walking, not toward the main house, but toward a smaller, darker shape she had barely noticed, set 100 yards away under a solitary, skeletal-looking cottonwood. She followed, her legs stiff, her body a single, comprehensive ache. The structure was a line shack, little more than a single room. It was old, the wood weathered to a silver gray, but as he pushed the door open, he stepped aside to let her enter first. Inside it was clean. A fire was already laid in the small stone fireplace, waiting for a match. A simple cot with a clean, folded blanket sat against one wall. On a small, rough-hewn table stood a pitcher of water, a basin, and a bar of soap. He had prepared this. He had anticipated her. He placed her trunk at the foot of the cot. Then he did something that shifted the very foundation of her fear. He pointed to the inside of the door. There was a heavy wooden bolt, newly oiled and functional. "Locks from the inside," he said. His eyes met hers for a brief, unblinking moment. It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of principle. He was giving her a space that was hers alone, a space where she could be safe from him. This gesture, in its stark, unspoken honor, was more profound than any flowery promise of protection she had ever received. It was a symbol of respect for her autonomy, a concept so foreign in her recent life that she could barely process it. He was not her captor. He was, for reasons she could not fathom, her reluctant guardian. "Food's on the table," he grunted, gesturing to a covered plate he had brought with him. A piece of roasted chicken and some beans. He had likely eaten his own meal hours before, while she was still on the road. This too was a provision made without presents, a caretaking that asked for nothing in return. He turned to leave, a large, quiet shape disappearing into the encroaching darkness. "Caleb," she said, her voice catching him at the door. He stopped but did not turn. "My name is Elara." He stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between the two cabins. Then, without another word, he stepped out and pulled the door shut, leaving her alone in the flickering lamplight of her new, temporary world. She slid the heavy bolt home. The sound was a solid, definitive thud. It was the first time she had felt the master of her own door in a very long time. The days that followed fell into a silent, unspoken rhythm. A pattern of provision began. Each morning when she opened her door, she would find a bucket of fresh water on the step, and often something more. A pail of milk still warm from the cow, a few eggs nestled in a cloth, a loaf of dense dark bread wrapped in wax paper. He never waited for her to emerge. The offerings were left like gifts from a ghost, evidence of his constant, relentless labor. She would see him from her window, a distant figure moving with the sun, mending fences, plowing a new field, his energy a force of nature in itself. He was a man locked in a perpetual solitary battle with the land, and he seemed to be winning, inch by hard-won inch. Elara watched him. At first her observation was purely analytical, the way a prisoner studies her guard. She learned the cadence of his day, The pre-dawn departure to the barn, the midday break, where he would sit on the porch of his own cabin for 15 minutes, staring out at the horizon, the long hours in the fields that ended only when the light failed completely. But as the days turned into a week and then two, her observation evolved. She began to see not just the man of action, but the man underneath. She saw the way his large, rough hands were surprisingly gentle when he checked a horse's hoof. She saw the patience with which he repaired a broken piece of harness, his brow furrowed in concentration. And sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, she would see him stand by the two small fenced off mounds on the hill behind his cabin, his head bowed, a solitary statue of grief. Her fear of him slowly, imperceptibly, began to dissolve, replaced by a complex, cautious understanding. He was not a monster. He was a man who had built a fortress of solitude around a core of immense pain. Confined to her small cabin, Elara began the quiet work of reclaiming her own agency. She was not made for idleness. The initial days were spent in a state of suspended animation, but the habit of survival was too deeply ingrained. She began to create a life within her four walls. She scrubbed the small cabin until the wood gleamed. She meticulously organized her few possessions. She mended the tears in her traveling dress, her stitches small and perfect. This was not domesticity, it was a rebellion against despair. It was the act of imposing order on a small corner of a chaotic world. It was a declaration that she was still a person, not just a piece of human cargo waiting for delivery. One afternoon, while Caleb was in a far pasture, she ventured out. She walked down to the creek, her satchel still chained to her wrist, and found a patch of wild mint growing along the bank. She gathered it carefully, her knowledge of herbs a forgotten relic of a gentler childhood. Back in her cabin, she crushed the leaves and steeped them. The next morning, she waited. When she heard the soft thud of the water bucket being placed on her step, she opened the door before he could turn away. He froze, startled, like a wild animal caught unexpectedly at a salt lick. He was not used to being seen during his morning ritual. She held out a steaming tin cup. He stared at it, then at her. His face was a mask of confusion. "It's mint tea," she said, her voice quiet. It was the most they had spoken in 2 weeks. He looked from the cup to her face, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. He was a man who expected nothing from the world, and this offering, this simple gesture, was a complication he did not understand. She held it out, her arm steady, refusing to retreat. It was her first offering, a small bridge across the vast, silent chasm between them. It was not an act of subservience, but a gesture between equals, a payment of sorts for the shelter he provided. After a long, tense moment, he reached out and took the cup. His calloused fingers brushed hers, a brief, shocking point of contact. He took a tentative sip. His expression did not change, but he did not spit it out. He held the cup, nodded once, a curt, almost imperceptible dip of his chin, and walked away toward the barn. Alara watched him go, the empty space on her palm still tingling from the brief touch. It was a beginning. A month after her arrival, the first snows dusted the high peaks of the mountains, a stark white warning of the winter to come. The air grew crisp, and the days shortened. The question of Silas Stone hung between them, unspoken but ever present. Alara knew, and she knew Caleb knew, that no one was coming for her before the winter locked them in. The roads would soon be impassable. One evening, as she sat on the step of her cabin, watching the sky turn a deep, bruised purple, he approached. He did not stop at a distance, as he usually did, but walked directly to her, stopping a few feet away. He was holding a piece of paper in his hand. It was the bill of lading for the plow, the official document from the freight office in Redemption. He stood before her, the paper held loosely in his hand. "This is the only claim anyone has," he said, his voice low. "It says I picked up a plow. Says nothing about a woman." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and unwavering. "Stone knows you're here. I sent word with the trapper last week. Told him the roads would be closed soon. Told him if he wanted his property, he'd best come now." Ilara's blood ran cold. The word property struck her like a blow. Her face must have shown her fear because his expression softened for a barest fraction of a second. "He sent word back," Caleb continued. "He said the winter could have you. He's a busy man." The casual cruelty of it stole her breath. She was nothing, a piece of furniture to be collected at a later convenience. Then Caleb did something that changed everything. He held out the bill of lading, the flimsy paper that was the only official record of her connection to this place, to him, and he held it over the small flame of the lantern that sat on the porch of his own cabin nearby. The corner of the paper caught, blackened, and then burst into a bright orange flame. He held it until the fire licked at his fingers, then dropped the last burning scrap to the ground, where he crushed it into ash with the heel of his boot. There is no record, he said, his voice flat. No one is coming for you. No one is looking for you. When the thaw comes, you are free to go. The road east is as open as the road west. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the vast, lonely landscape that surrounded them. But winter here, it's not for the unprepared. He was not imprisoning her. He was giving her a choice and laying out the stark consequences of that choice. He had burned the deed. He had symbolically, and in the only way that mattered in this lawless land, set her free. Her continued presence was now her own decision. She looked from the ashes on the ground to his steady, quiet face and knew that her life, for better or for worse, was now intertwined with his. The arrival of the threat was not a dramatic thunderclap, but a quiet, chilling omen. It came in the form of three riders, appearing as dark specks on the distant horizon, growing slowly, inexorably larger. It was a week after Caleb had burned the bill of lading, a week of cold, clear autumn days where a fragile truce had settled over the homestead. Elara saw them first from the window of her cabin. Her heart seized. Strangers were never a good sign in a place this isolated. She watched them, her mind, honed by years of living among dangerous men, instantly analyzing their formation, their steady, unhurried pace. These were not lost travelers. They rode with purpose. She grabbed her cloak and hurried out, not to the main cabin, but to the rise behind the barn, where she could watch without being seen. Caleb was already there. He stood behind a rocky outcropping, a rifle resting in the crook of his arm, his body utterly still. He had seen them long before she had. He did not seem surprised to see her, only glanced at her, a question in his eyes. They ride like they own the land, she said, her voice low and tight. It was an observation, not a complaint. He grunted in agreement. That's Silas Stone in the lead, he said, his voice a low rumble. The other two are hired guns from Redemption, the kind of men who work for whiskey and blood. Alara's gaze fixed on the lead rider. Even from a distance, she could see the arrogance in his posture, the expensive cut of his coat. This was the man who had thought to own her, the man who had deemed her worth less than a winter's inconvenience. A cold, hard fury, an emotion she had not allowed herself to feel for a long time, began to smolder deep within her. The riders did not approach the house. They stopped just outside the fence line, a clear challenge. Stone dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He was a large man, gone to seed, his face florid and smug. He cupped his hands around his mouth. Caleb, I've come for what's mine. His voice rolled across the valley, oily and confident. Caleb did not answer. He remained a stone statue, watching, waiting. The silence stretched, becoming a weapon in itself. Stone's confident smirk began to waver. He was a man used to immediate obedience. I know you have her, you sod-busting hermit. The deal was for the girl in the ledgers. Send her out, and we can forget this whole misunderstanding. Elara froze. The ledgers. He knew. Of course he knew. The small satchel, still chained to her wrist, suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She looked at Caleb. His face was unreadable, but she saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. He did not know about the ledgers. He had taken her in out of a reluctant, stubborn sense of honor, thinking she was just a woman sold into a bad bargain. Now the stakes had been raised impossibly high. She was not just a victim, she was a liability, a walking declaration of war against men like Silas Stone. The ledgers? Caleb's voice was dangerously quiet. He did not look at her. His eyes were still fixed on the men below. They detail every bribe, every land grab, every murder the railroad syndicate has committed for the last 5 years, she said, her own voice flat, devoid of emotion. I was their bookkeeper. I was meant to be silenced, but Stone thought he could use the information for himself. He arranged my passage to get me, and them, under his control. This was the vulnerable revelation, not of a past sorrow, but of a present, deadly danger. She had brought this plague to his door. You should give them to me, she said, her voice cracking for the first time. Let me walk out there. This is my fight. For the first time, he turned and looked at her, his eyes boring into hers. He saw the terror she was trying to hide, but he also saw the iron resolve. She was willing to sacrifice herself to protect him, a man she barely knew. And in that moment, something shifted in the barren landscape of his heart. She was no longer a burden he had been forced to carry. She was a person, fierce and brave and foolish, and she was standing on his land. No, he said, the word absolute. He turned his attention back to the men below. This is my land. They crossed my fence. It was that simple. The world, for Caleb, was reduced to a single, unassailable principle. He was defending his home, and she, he had just realized, was now part of it. The siege began, not with a bang, but with a waiting game. Stone and his men set up a crude camp just out of easy rifle range, content to try and starve them out. They thought time was on their side. That was their first mistake. The second was underestimating the woman. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Caleb moved her from the line shack to the main cabin. The separation between them was gone, destroyed by the external threat. The cabin was small, a single room with a sleeping loft. He gave her the loft without discussion, a continuation of the unspoken honor he had shown her from the beginning. They were forced into a proximity that was both suffocating and strangely intimate. They moved around each other in the dim lantern light, the air thick with unspoken words. They'll try to cut us off from the water, she said, looking out the small shuttered window toward the creek. They'll wait by the barn, thinking you'll need to tend to the animals. Caleb looked at her, surprised by her tactical assessment. She was right. The well by the house is deep. It'll last us, he replied, his own assessment. The animals are in the barn. They have water and feed for a week. A silent conversation passed between them. They were assessing resources, planning a defense, their minds working in an unexpected complementary rhythm. He was the soldier, focused on the mechanics of the fight. She was the strategist, seeing the larger patterns, the enemy's intent. The first attack came just before dawn. A single shot shattered the morning quiet, splintering the wood of the cabin door. It was a test, designed to draw fire, to reveal their position. Caleb was already in place by the front window, his rifle ready. Elara was not cowering in the corner, as he might have expected. She was by the back window, holding one of his spare pistols, her hands surprisingly steady. One man is circling around to the east, she said, her voice calm. He's using the rock formations for cover. The other is staying with Stone near the fence line. Caleb stared at her. She had seen the movement in the pre-dawn gloom, a detail he had missed while focused on the main threat. He nodded, a flicker of profound respect in his eyes. The battle became a deadly dance. Caleb was a superb marksman, his shots economical and precise, designed to conserve ammunition and keep the attackers at bay. But it was Elara who gave them the edge. Her mind, trained to find patterns in columns of numbers, now found them in the ebb and flow of the fight. They attack every 2 hours, she noted on the second day. Just after the sun clears a new landmark, they are impatient. She had also noticed that the man circling east had a habit of pausing behind the same large boulder before each advance. There, she said, pointing. When he gets there, he thinks he is safe. Caleb trusted her. He set up his second rifle, the one with the powerful scope, and waited. It took an hour. The man moved as she had predicted, darting from rock to rock. He reached the large boulder and leaned against it, taking a moment to catch his breath. Caleb fired. The shot echoed across the valley. The man crumpled and did not get up. Down at the camp, they saw Stone leap to his feet, shouting, his arrogance finally cracking. They were down to 2, and the 2 in the cabin were not just surviving. They were fighting as a single competent unit. They moved without speaking, anticipating each other's needs. She would reload a rifle while he fired another. She would pass him a canteen of water, her eyes never leaving the windows, her mind tracking the enemy. The final confrontation came on the third night, born of Stone's desperation. A storm had been brewing, and the wind howled around the small cabin, a mournful, wild sound. Under the cover of the wind and darkness, Stone and his remaining man decided to risk a direct assault, hoping to set the cabin ablaze. But Elara had anticipated this too. The wind, she had said earlier, her face illuminated by the lantern. It's in our favor. A fire would be driven back on them. They heard the scrape of boots on gravel, the telltale clink of a canteen. Caleb motioned for her to stay down. He stood by the door, his largest shotgun in his hands. The door burst open with a splintering crash. A dark shape filled the doorway, a torch held high. Caleb fired. The shotgun's roar was deafening in the small space. The man flew backward, the torch arcing through the air and landing in a patch of dry grass. Outside, Silas Stone screamed in rage and frustration. He fired his pistol wildly into the cabin, the bullets thudding into the thick log walls. Caleb was already pushing Elara toward the back window. Go! He yelled. Get to the rocks! But she did not go. She grabbed the rifle she had been cleaning and leveled it over the edge of the window frame. Outside, the grass fire was spreading, its light illuminating Stone as he fumbled to reload his pistol. He was a perfect silhouette against the flames. Elara did not hesitate. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. Silas Stone staggered, dropped his pistol, and fell to his knees before toppling face first into the dirt. Silence fell, broken only by the howling of the wind and the crackle of the spreading fire. In the quiet, breathless aftermath of the fight, the world seemed to have shrunk to the four walls of the cabin. The immediate danger was gone, vanquished, and lying still in the dirt outside, but the emotional walls between them had been irrevocably breached. The adrenaline of the siege gave way to a profound, shared exhaustion. Caleb barred the shattered door with a heavy table, his movements slow and deliberate. Elara sank onto a stool by the cold hearth, the rifle still held loosely in her hands. Her knuckles were white. She was trembling, not from fear, but from the violent release of years of pent-up rage and terror. The man she had just killed was the living embodiment of every threat she had ever faced. Caleb walked over to her. He did not speak. He gently took the rifle from her hands, unloaded it, and set it aside. Then he knelt before her. He reached out, not to comfort her, but to unfasten the chain that bound the satchel to her wrist. His fingers were surprisingly deft as he worked the small lock on the manacle. The chain fell away with a soft clatter. It was the last shackle of her old life. He looked at her, his eyes, for the first time, holding a raw, unguarded emotion. It was a mixture of awe, concern, and a deep, soul-shaking recognition. He saw her now, not as an outsider or a burden, but as the woman who had fought beside him, who had saved his life as surely as he had saved hers. He rose and went to the sleeping loft, returning with a blanket, which he draped around her trembling shoulders. He then moved to the basin of water on the table and wet a cloth. He came back and began to gently wipe the gunpowder residue from her hands. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, that it broke through the dam of her control. A single tear tracked a clean path through the grime on her cheek. He paused, then continued his work, his touch firm and steady, a silent anchor in the storm that was still raging inside her. In that moment, in the hushed quiet of the cabin, surrounded by the evidence of their shared battle, a new language was being born between them. It was a language of action, of care, of a profound unspoken understanding. The morning after, the world was transformed. A blanket of fresh snow had fallen during the night, covering the land in a pristine, silent white. It muffled the sounds of the world and hid the scars of the previous night's violence. The fire had been extinguished by the snow, and the bodies of the men were now just shapeless mounds beneath the white blanket. The world felt clean, new, and unnervingly quiet. Caleb and Elara moved through the morning chores in this new world, the silence between them no longer one of tension or uncertainty, but of a shared, somber peace. He cleared the snow from the path, and she heated water for coffee. There was no discussion of what would happen next. There was no need. She did not return to the line shack. Her few belongings were moved into the main cabin, her books finding a place on a shelf next to his sparse collection of almanacs, her mending kit placed on the mantelpiece. The two separate, solitary lives they had been leading had merged into one household. Her presence began to soften the hard edges of his existence. The cabin, which had been a functional, soulless shelter, began to feel like a home. The scent of baking bread sometimes mingled with the smell of wood smoke and gun oil. A pot of wild herbs she had gathered sat on the windowsill, its green a splash of life against the gray wood. Their partnership, forged in the crucible of the siege, became an open and acknowledged fact of their daily lives. A new dialogue emerged, one spoken not in words, but in shared tasks and comfortable silences. He began to teach her the skills she would need to survive the winter. He showed her how to read the snow for animal tracks, how to set a snare, how to split wood with a clean, efficient stroke. She, in turn, brought a quiet order to his life. She organized his chaotic pantry, mended the worn cuffs of his shirts, and her steady, calm presence seemed to fill the empty spaces in the cabin that had long been haunted by ghosts. She never spoke of the ledgers, which she had burned in the fireplace the day after the snowstorm, watching the paper curl into black ash, finally freeing herself completely from her past. He never asked. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the wind howling its winter song outside, he was cleaning his rifle and she was reading a book. The silence was companionable, a warm blanket against the cold. He stopped his work and looked at the way the firelight caught the gold in her hair. He thought of the years he had spent alone in this cabin. The silence then had been a hollow, aching thing. Now it was full. He remembered the woman everyone in town had pitied, the delicate, out of place lady waiting for a man who would not come. He looked at the woman sitting across from him now, resilient, capable, fierce, and he knew he had been as wrong as everyone else. He cleared his throat, a rough, unaccustomed sound in the quiet room. She looked up from her book, her stormy gray eyes questioning. He struggled for the words, a man who had forgotten their shape and feel. He gestured vaguely around the room, at the mended curtains, at the neatly stacked firewood, at her. The house was quiet for a long time, he said, his voice a low gravel. I had forgotten what it sounded like with a life in it. It was not a declaration of love, not a poem or a promise. It was something more real, more honest. It was a confession. It was the acknowledgement of a profound, irreversible change. It was the simple, unadorned truth. And Elara, who had been traded, sold, and hunted, who had learned to survive in a world of lies, heard in his simple words the only truth that now mattered. She smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes, and turned back to her book. Her presence in his home, in his life, now as fixed and certain as the northern star in the winter sky. The cowboy who had wanted nothing more than to be left alone had found the one thing he could no longer live without.